Hello, sisters. I am delaying slightly to make sure that everybody has come in. Okay, I think we can begin now. It's lovely to be with you, sisters, whatever time you are at and wherever you are at. Now, it's my pleasure today to be discussing a very important book, which is The Prostitution of Sexuality by Kathleen Barry from 1995 with Meagan Tyler. I'll just hold up this book. Here we are. Now, first of all, I'll start off by introducing you to Meagan. Now, Dr. Meagan Tyler is an academic based in Melbourne, Australia. She's written extensively about men's violence against women in a range of contexts, from the sex industry to disaster recovery. She has authored a book called Selling Sex Short, The Pornographic and Sexological Construction of Women's Sexuality, a book called Wildfire and Power, Policy and Practice, and she has edited Freedom Fallacy, The Limits of Liberal Feminism. And more of her work, which is free to access, can be found on her website, her webpage at Royal Melbourne Institute of Technology, RMIT. And she sometimes tweets at Dr. Meagan Tyler. Now, it's a particular pleasure for me to be talking with Meagan, because I have known her for 21 years, since she took my sexual politics undergraduate course when she was 18 years old, which is... How long? I know, it's wonderful. I mean, you become family after that long. You know.
Exactly.
Exactly. She also tutored on my subjects at Melbourne Uni for several years. And then she did her wonderful PhD with me on pornography and sexology, which became her first book. She was in the Coalition Against Trafficking Australia for many years before I retired back to the UK in 2015. And when I retired back, I was able to leave it in her very safe and capable hands, which is marvelous. So you can see why it is a particular pleasure to be able to talk with her today, particularly about this subject, which we have worked on together for some time. Now, I'll go on to talk about Kathleen Barry, a bit of background on Kathleen Barry. She's an American feminist activist and sociologist. She was involved from the very beginnings of the women's liberation movement in the US, and she was one of the authors of the wonderful Fourth World Manifesto, which is a very powerful statement of radical feminism from 1971. She was involved in feminist activism against violence against women for 10 years before she published her first book, Female Sexual Slavery, in 1979. And I'll just hold that one up. Here we are, Female Sexual Slavery. And that book is a profound radical feminist analysis of prostitution, which contains the bones of all the work that I've done on prostitution and written about prostitution. And she has a definition of sexual slavery. This is her definition from Female Sexual Slavery. She says what she wanted to do was put prostitution in the context of the whole of the subordination of women and really sort of center that on prostitution. So she says female sexual slavery is present in all situations where girls and women cannot change the immediate conditions of their existence, where regardless of how they got into those conditions, they cannot get out, and where they're subject to violence and exploitation. And how far she intended to go with this, I'm not entirely sure. Obviously, she includes the situations of domestic violence, all those situations, as she says, where women are trapped and unable to get out of their situation. I think it was a very, very useful definition at the time, because feminists don't usually talk about in quite such radical terms as to actually speak about female sexual slavery and use those words. So that book was really, really important book. And prostitution was her main focus at that time. And she was a founding figure in the late 1980s in the creation of the Coalition Against Trafficking in Women, which is the international NGO that campaigns for the abolition of prostitution. And she was the leading figure in the creation of the Convention Against Sexual Exploitation, 1991, which I shall talk about later. Now, Meagan, could you say why you chose Kathleen Barry's second book, The Prostitution of Sexuality, for discussion?
There were a lot of reasons, and I've had like 20 years to think about them now, right? So it was wonderful to get this opportunity to talk about the prostitution of sexuality, because I have used it so often in my work. And Sheila, when you approached me about this, it was just a book that really came to the forefront of my mind in terms of something that I've returned to really often. And also, I think, like a number of other texts that you've looked at in this series, it probably doesn't get the love it deserves. I think it's maybe not as prominent as some others, and so another really good chance then to give it a little bit of a spotlight. So the concept of the prostitution of sexuality, I think, in particular, moving on from female sexual slavery, I mean, it was obviously extremely useful to me when I was looking at things like the pornographication of culture, because it's kind of already providing a framework for us understanding that even sort of before it's happening, before it's being documented in even kind of newspaper articles, before it hits the academy. It's giving you a conceptual framework for understanding what is happening. And so obviously that appealed to me in doing the kind of work that I do. But the book covers a lot of ground. It doesn't just focus on that, even though that's the title, and obviously is hugely important throughout. But there are really some great, I think she's got some great, really pithy quotes scattered sort of throughout the text. And I pick them up different bits, I think, every time I go back to it. But it covers, everything from, well, I think particularly the early sections and the later sections are probably the strongest in terms of good concepts and good theory that can be applied in a number of ways. But, if you also look at things like the radical potential of human rights frameworks that she talks about towards the end, really picking apart liberal notions of consent and legalistic notions of consent, and why as feminists we should move away from those, something that is still, I feel, constantly forgotten in public debates about sexual violence. Kind of, I think, grounding a lot of what she's talking about in the power dynamics of heterosexuality and the social construction of sexuality, which, again, I think has oddly become kind of, it's not really popular anymore, is it, Sheila? Let's put it that way. To talk about the social construction of sexuality seems even more unpopular now than I think when you first introduced me to the idea in the early 2000s. We might get a chance to talk a bit about that. But also there's some nice bits at the end, I think, about the importance of consciousness raising and bringing that into the discussion as well for both personal and political reasons. So I'm not sure we'll get to all of that, but hopefully we'll cover quite a bit of it. And I also chose it, for personal reasons, in that I've come back to it a lot for a variety of different projects over my career. And you can see my kind of old battered copy. It has all these different coloured notes and different bits sticking out of it of use over the last sort of 15 years. It was a really lovely opportunity to be able to make connections again in that way.
Thank you. Now, can you say what time or what moment in your academic career, your feminist career even, you came across it? And I think you may already have said some of this, but is there anything else about the effect that it had on you?
Yeah, well, I was actually, when I was looking back through this, I used it a lot for my PhD, and that's the first time I consciously remember engaging with it. But did you ever use any quotes from it in your teaching? Because I might have actually come across it then.
I'm not sure, but if I did, I would probably have used female sexual slavery, not the prostitution of sexuality, in fact.
Okay, so I was familiar with her work, but maybe not this text specifically. So it definitely had an impact on me. There were some really, I think particularly, as I've said, the early and later parts of the book is probably much more traditional political science in its approach. And that really appealed to me, having trained as a political scientist. So I didn't really engage with the book fully until I was into some of my PhD research. And then I think its value was very obvious to me. In particular, early on in that research, she has these great quotes that summarize, a lot of work that other feminists have done, including you, obviously, Sheila, in linking sexology and pornography. And given that that was the topic of my thesis, I was really grateful that she had these. I'm going to read out one now. She just says, in the industrialized world, the social cultural production of sexuality, in inverted commas, the sexuality of normalized prostitution, has developed and been deployed through the science of sex, sexology, and its counterpart, pornography, the graphic representation of prostitution sex. And I kind of think she manages to get so much. It's a sentence,
very good,
and
yes.
Yet, yeah, isn't it? It is. And I think that's one of the great strengths of the book, is that it has these amazing kind of summaries that appear and crystallize maybe other elements of feminist thinking. So I really appreciate that aspect of it. So the prostitution of sexuality as a concept obviously had a huge effect on me, and I've carried that through. I was just thinking back, I've used it in so many other projects since. In fact, I just had a chapter published with Maddie Coy on, of all things, I'm going to have to look this up because I can't remember off the top of my head. It's not my area. Contentious Cities, Design and the Gendered Production of Space, which has a very cute cover. But I never thought that's something I would end up writing in. And we used Barry's concept of the prostitution of sexuality to explain how public spaces can become really hostile for women if you have a situation of very normalised pornography and prostitution, as there is in somewhere like Melbourne and many other places around the globe.
That's really important. In Penile Imperialism, my next book, I also have a section on what happens to public space around brothels and strip clubs and through advertising and so on. There's actually very little on it. So I was
astounded.
It's very good. There's going to be a whole book and you've written something, because it's crucially important. We cannot ignore it in our daily lives, and our lives are really constrained by it.
Absolutely. And I think that's one of the things I wrote as a note to myself that I enjoyed about the book, is that it gives you a framework for that anger. I think sometimes, it's not extremely high theory. I think it is quite accessible for the most part, but it gives you a good framework of understanding. And I think also hopefulness, I really enjoy it towards the end. I probably didn't appreciate this so much when I was doing my PhD, but subsequently, Barry's ideas about the radical potential of human rights frameworks, I think it's interesting revisiting that now, because she's obviously writing in 95, where I think there's huge hope actually for a lot of the UN conventions and feminist action through those frameworks in a way that there might not be now. I think we're a bit more perhaps jaded and cynical about those options.
I think so.
And perhaps you could say fairly so. But I do like that there is an assertion there that we don't have to give in to a liberal framework of individualized rights. We can assert women's rights as a sex class, a collective right to be free from sexual exploitation. And particularly at the end where she says we're allowed to maintain our moral outrage at that, that's a nice rallying cry towards the end, I think, too. So they're the things that have probably mostly stayed with me. I know that's a lot, but they're the things that I use all the time.
Yes, that's thank you. Now, in my case, I was familiar with Barry's first book, which is Female Sexual Slavery. And my copy of that book is from 1984, so I must have read it in 1984. I had written, I was involved in challenging prostitution at that time, in the late 1970s, in fact. And I wrote my first paper against prostitution, against men's use of women in prostitution in 1979 for a conference. And in London, when that book came out in about 1984, I was in Women Against Violence Against Women, and we were trying to deal with the English collective of prostitutes who were sort of accepted the existence of prostitution and so on, and we did not. So there was the English collective of prostitutes, Women Against Violence Against Women, and we were opposed when that book came out. Then when the Prostitution of Sexuality came out in 1995, I was, as I said before, a little bit surprised because I wasn't quite sure how different it was from the first book. Now, around that time, 1994, I had asked Kathy Barry at a conference where we were both speakers if I could set up an Australian branch of the Coalition Against Trafficking in Women, which she was still running at the time. And so I created the Australian branch later that year. and it is still going. Thank heavens for that. So that's the sort of context of both of those books for me. Meagan, can you give an overview of the book, because our listeners will probably mostly not have read it, explaining how it's arranged and what it covers?
Can do. Just seeing some nice familiar names there in the chat. That's made me smile as well. So as I said before, I think that the early and latter parts are probably the most useful in terms of application elsewhere. So you begin with this overview of the prostitution of sexuality as a concept, although in some ways I think it's not fully, I was going to say fleshed out, but fleshed out is always such an unfortunate turn of phrase when we're discussing these issues. It is. That it's brought up again in the later stages, and I think in some ways is better given more detail and more depth. So then you've got an outline of sexual power and an understanding of the social construction of sexuality and the power dynamics of heterosexuality, which is obviously hugely important in the links that she's trying to make, as you mentioned before, as well in female sexual slavery, Sheila, that this isn't a class of women set aside. We need to understand what happens in prostitution as linked to what happens to all women. And that's a theme that really runs throughout the book, but she sets it up nice and early. Then there are some middle chapters that are kind of I didn't think this at the time, but reading it back in a slightly unusual order, I think, in a way. So you've got real detail around the activism of Josephine Butler and the first wave of protest against prostitution, which is interesting. And I think it gives Barry a chance to reflect on her own activism and maybe what went wrong in the past and what we can fix in the future. But then that follows on to the industrialization of sex, which, and again, I think is maybe something that's been left off the importance in analyses that have followed on from here, is really the implications of Western imperialism for the prostitution of women elsewhere around the world. And I think, that's really fallen even in political science discourse from this understanding that she's setting out in 95 about, like, yes, of course, we all accept that there is this kind of Western hegemony and that there is huge economic power vested in these places, and that creates exploitation of women elsewhere. That seems to have kind of been lost, I think, those structural analyses of power that aren't there even in normal political science anymore. So then kind of linking that to the traffic in women and understanding the flows from certain places to other places. There's a lot of detail in there. These aren't really the theoretical chapters. So obviously a significant amount of it is out of date in terms of giving you the most up-to-date sense of what's going on in the world. But it is interesting, I think, to compare to now, looking 25 years on, what has changed. Then looking at pimping as the oldest profession. And again, there's a lot of detail in that of trying to understand what pimping is, how it's a relationship of terror over women, which I think links in very well to what you were discussing just the other week in Dee Graham's Loving to Survive. And she does actually mention that at one point, that it had obviously just come out before she publishes this. So there's a nice connection there. Then talking about the state and how the state is implicated in particular legislative approaches to prostitution, and the way in which it's this pre-Nordic model, and I think we'll get on to talking about that, but the outline she's giving of different approaches, it's explaining the ways in which they just reinforce patriarchal and harmful norms for women. Then there's a very interesting chapter, which I find is, again, it's kind of slightly oddly placed, but on Patty Hearst, and again, with what you were talking about with societal Stockholm syndrome and Dee Graham, looking at her as this kind of prototype of female sexual slavery, and then applying that sort of, I think it's interesting because it so mirrors, Graham's argument about this individual case. What is that like if we extrapolated it out to a societal level, and the way in which all women live in terror of men's violence to some extent or other? And then finally, the hopeful kind of chapter of human rights and global feminist action that I've already touched on. And then I think something you're going to talk about a little bit more, Sheila, is at the end, there's an appendix, which is the proposed convention against sexual exploitation, which, I think we would now say is this example of, external and impact focused work in the academy that we're told is really, really important. But I think we've always thought that with feminist activism, right? She's trying to put the theory into practice. What would it actually look like to change women's lives?
Yeah, thank you. Now, as you were talking, I mean, you talked about the Patricia Hearst chapter, and I think that was very important. That was in female sexual slavery as well. And everything I know about Patricia Hearst comes from that, the whole issue of whether she consented because she was involved with the Symbionese Liberation Front, which was an anarchist group, and she eventually, after being imprisoned and raped and multiply raped, she took part in actions with them, and then she was sent to prison. So it's a very, very interesting question. She was clearly in female sexual slavery, which is what Kathleen Barry seeks to point out. But something else I was thinking when you were talking about the chapter on pimping, I can remember that in its original form, which is in female sexual slavery, and I can remember thinking, and I think she must perhaps point this out, that she talks about the turning out process by which pimps turn out women in prostitution. I've never forgotten it, it's very clear. And she talks about how the women are, of course, first of all, given a new name. Then they are moved, so they are taken away from their family and their friends so that they have absolutely no recourse. It's exactly the same as what happens in trafficking, of course, from one country to another. But she was talking about the states, so they're moved from one town to another. And I remember thinking at the time, and I think she made clear, that it's very similar to what happens in marriage, which is that the woman loses her name and she is often moved. From one family to another, if not in other ways, or if not cities. And she is cut off from her friends very often. A man is able to imprison her within the marriage. So it's very, very interesting similarities between pimping and marriage, which I do remember thinking were very, very usefully made at that time. And of course, she would argue that there are definite similarities in all these forms of female sexual slavery.
Of course. I mean, it was interesting. Did you think reading it back when I was reading it this time, I thought, oh, you'd struggle to, I think, be allowed to write that in a book now without more justification. And I was sort of thinking, it seems like we've lost the ability to say, you know, she's not saying they're identical. She's saying they're connected and on a continuum. And it almost sort of reminded me of, you know, Liz Kelly's continuum of sexual violence is used everywhere all the time still, very accepted, you know, kind of foundational work for understanding men's violence against women. But this is almost just trying to do that at a macro level. Like that's understanding the links between sexual harassment and rape. This is trying to understand the links between, trafficking, marriage, and other kind of larger societal structures that justify and kind of provide a foundation for men's violence.
And it could never be accepted now. You're probably aware that I had problems with penile imperialism with the editor at my publisher, making big trouble about me talking about use words like reign of terror and so on. So the sort of thing she was to female sexual slavery, you never would have gotten away with that. Just the concept could not really have been used. So, but NYU Press did have feminists at the press at that time. Feminist books were able to be published. But no, it's impossible to imagine now to be able to make these leaps, to create feminist theory and understanding on that macro scale. You're simply not allowed now. You know, in academia, you have to do things that are as small and micro as you possibly can, and then you're allowed to be an expert on a particular variety of the bumblebee or whatever it is. So yes, what she was doing would simply not be possible, but I want it to be possible again. I want these books published again, these wonderful, broad feminist books, putting everything together. Now, what would you say are the most important themes and arguments? You may have covered some of these, but are there any other things that you think are important?
It might be worth going into a bit more detail, I suppose, about the concept of prostitution of sexuality, given that is the title, and the way that I have understood it as sort of a twin concept with the sexuality of prostitution. So you have to understand what the sexuality of prostitution is taken to mean before you understand her argument about that becoming normalized and what that means kind of more broadly, culturally and socially. So there's certainly the aspects of it I've used most often, I suppose, and they still stick out for me as some of the most enduringly relevant. And so when she's talking about the sexuality of prostitution, I think the thing that I kept coming back to about the book, and it's something she actually establishes in Female Sexual Slavery, is that there's been this endless focus in the social science literature on the defining element of prostitution as being the exchange of money. It's the fact that it's commercial that makes it prostitution. And she's saying that that's a distraction, really. And I've got a good quote that I used once before in this great collection of Maddie Coy's about prostitution, harm, and gender inequality. And so this is from very early on in Female Sexual Slavery, where she says, feminist analysis of sexual power is often modified to make it fit an economic analysis, which defines economic exploitation as the primary instrument of female oppression. Under that system of thought, institutionalized sexual slavery, such as is found in prostitution, is understood in terms of economic exploitation. Undoubtedly, economic exploitation is an important factor in the oppression of women, but here we must be concerned with whether or not economic analysis reveals the more fundamental sexual domination of women. And so she kind of continues that argument on and says, perhaps more than that, it's a distraction, and that we need to focus on this as a dehumanizing vision of sexuality, one that gives one person power over another, and that we can't understand the dynamics of that without understanding men's power as a class over women as a class, and that we need to see that objectifying, or that commercializing objectification is just a more extreme form of objectification and harm than is found in really normal heterosexual relations, is kind of what she's getting at to some degree. But then it comes full circle, because you have this worse version, this more objectified, more dehumanized version of sexuality and prostitution fed back into cultural norms of heterosexuality. So it's always pushing the boundaries of normal, non-prostitution heterosexuality further and further to mirror prostitution, and that is the prostitution of sexuality. And she talks about it in kind of very easy to follow material terms, in the way that that's been exported through military prostitution or through mail order bride kind of services, trafficking women in various forms, but then also just the normalization of prostitution and pornography in everyday life in much of the West, for example. And I think one of the things that, again, I really like about her analysis of it, and it's something that I know dovetails with work you've done, Sheila, is the idea that when she's talking about the stages that the traffic in women to some degree has gone through, so you have kind of this feudal system where the family and marriage control women largely. Then you have a variety of interruptions of industrialization, military occupation, and that kind of splinters the forms of prostitution of women, forces some out into the public sphere. And then in late industrialization or post-industrialization, where you have women in the public sphere in all kinds of ways, you have to find a way to sexually subordinate them again. And that you do that through actual systems of prostitution, but also by normalizing prostitution in the public sphere, so that women come to represent sex, and sex represents objectification and dehumanization and subordination. And she talks about it almost as a form of patriarchal compensation. That's as women become more equal in sort of particular ways, then this is a way of forcing them back into their place. And it really made me think of, your work in the industrial vagina and talking about things like strip clubs, the way that men then use them for business networking as a way around women's more formalized equality in the workplace, for example. Yes. I don't know if that's something you want to talk about at all.
Yes, no, I call it outsourcing women's subordination, in fact, in the industrial vagina, which is that if men are no longer able to have, in some situations, the extreme power and over women's bodies and use at will and in any way they wish in the Western country of origin, then they need to outsource in various ways through, of course, mail order brides, MALE order brides, and trafficking and so on. And as you were speaking, I was also thinking of as I talk about in Industrial Vagina, there's a feedback loop, which is that the colonial project sends the military out to countries in Asia, for instance, where they both use, if there is any form of the sex industry already existing, but also create military prostitution, create new forms and expand forms that are already there, one of which, of course, was hostess bars and strip clubs and so on. So forms of that. And then that is all brought back in the 1990s to the West, and we get the development of a huge strip club industry, completely normalized, which then, of course, starts creating the norms with the pole for exercise and with the way that women are supposed to dress and so on. So yes, it's very interesting to see the whole sort of feedback system by which these systems are created and brought back to create, as you say, the prostitution of sexuality here.
And she has a great way of summing that up,
yeah.
I think, another one of those pithy sentences. It just, gets to the heart of it, I think, and it says the prostitution of sexuality is the continuous reconfiguring of sex on men's terms to sustain women's subordination. And, it's great if you read the whole book, but if you don't, remember that sentence.
Yes, that's right. Now, I think that there's, one thing that I'll just say a couple of things that were interesting to me in particular about the book. And one of them was, as you've said, the way that this book, unlike Female Sexual Slavery, covers how we can abolish prostitution. How it's possible to begin to do that. And of course, because I and you were involved in this for some time, it's of particular interest here. And she says, for instance, something that was quite interesting to me. She says in the introduction that she was concerned by the way in which, by the 1990s, radical feminist activism had become concentrated on one issue only, that of pornography, and it did not include prostitution. And I remember being very concerned about that too, because of course, I was involved in writing about and working on both of these things in the 1970s, and I couldn't understand how pornography could be separated off from prostitution, but it was pretty much by the 1980s. These two things were not seen as connected, and there were big campaigns around pornography, really big, really very respectable campaigns about pornography that did not touch prostitution. And of course, as you know and say very often, prostitution is simply filmed to make pornography. So pornography is the filming of prostitution. You can't possibly make a separation there. But I have always wondered whether prostitution cannot be looked at, partly because often heterosexual women find it difficult to separate themselves from prostitution because what is maybe happening in their relationships. I can remember when I was doing a study tour in the Philippines in '95, one of the women on the tour, an Australian woman, said she'd thought about doing prostitution because really what's the difference? Meaning, what is the difference between the sex in her ordinary relationship? So the prostitution of sexuality really is very clear there. So maybe prostitution is a little close to home for some women, which is a very frightening thought. But also, I think pornography is seen as something which definitely affects ordinary, average heterosexual women in their homes and in their relationships. So it's important and it must be fought, which I agree. But those women very often may not have been able to recognize that violence was done to the women in the making of pornography, which was prostitution, and that violence is in the prostitution too, and that you can't separate those things. I think absolutely. And I mean, you do not separate them, and you make them very, very close and explain the connection.
But it makes you very unpopular for the same. I mean, exactly as you're describing it there, I think we're leading into the same position that there is now, it's much more publicly acceptable to be critical of pornography than it is around prostitution, systems of prostitution, even though, as you say, that's ridiculous. Pornography is in itself a system of prostitution, but it seems like there is a lot more, you can actually see people publishing in The Guardian now saying things like, oh yes, pornography actually is causing harmful sexual norms for young women and girls, and that's a bad thing. But then you get to prostitution and it goes all the way back to personal choice arguments and so on and so forth. So there's definitely, I think that separation is coming back with a vengeance, actually.
That's right. And if we start talking about prostitution, and which actually leads us to criticize the norms of the construction of sexuality, that's completely unacceptable.
Oh, well, then you're not fun anymore. Yeah.
No, not fun at all. That's right. Now, one of the, she does in the book cover some of the arguments that people made at the time, and some of them they still make, as to why prostitution is fine, as you say, and it's about consent, it's just sex, it's a form of work, etc. She doesn't cover all of those, but she covers some of them. And one of the arguments that it is just sex, I think she's got a quite useful riposte to that. She does have just a little statement in the book where she says, if a woman stays in prostitution an average of 9 years and takes an average of 5 customers a day, 6 days a week, she will have sold sex in, on, and through her body 9,540 times to different men in anonymous contacts. This is a conservative estimate. Now, I mean, that's a powerful statement, I think. And I think Andrea Dworkin has one as well, which is about the penis going into the body over and over and over again. And it's very difficult if you consider that to imagine that it's actually simply sex. But it did remind me when reading it again of an occasion back in the early 2000s, maybe, when I was at a conference in Birmingham speaking from a panel on prostitution as violence against women. And I explained the ways in which prostitution was violence against women, you know, dissociation and pain and so on and so on, and having to use anesthetics. And a woman stood up in the audience and she said to me that she had had 5,000 male clients, and everyone, she said, was a perfect gentleman. And this, of course, shows that the degree of subterfuge she needed to enter into from herself, apart from other people, to disguise what was happening. And I replied, I mean, I didn't want to be in any sense aggressive towards this woman who was, you know, really in a very difficult situation. So I said that I was pleased her experience was so positive, because many women who even have a handful of boyfriends are likely to find that one at least was abusive. So if you had 5,000 experiences, they could not all be perfect gentlemen. But the book is like that. She has lots of things in it that really bring up all these really important things that I've had to say, that we have, if we've been campaigning on prostitution for long enough. All of these things we've had to talk about. I think somebody's actually talking in the chat about the normalization of prostitution in universities. And I don't know whether you're aware, but in this country, at very prestigious universities like Durham University and others, they are now having advice and information on how to survive prostitution. And it's been completely normalized as something women would ordinarily have to do. So obviously they wouldn't allow this kind of stuff that we are talking about to be probably taught in their establishments these days. I mean, who knows?
No, it does seem very threatening, doesn't it?
Yes, I'm just going to share my screen here. And because there's something that I think that did interest me when I'm reading this again. I can remember when I read the Fourth World Manifesto, right back from 1971, what was really good was that the term that was used for the oppression of women was caste, not class even, but caste. And there was an explanation of why caste was the right term, because it's something that you absolutely cannot get out of. A caste cannot be changed. And then when I was reading through, I just saw what she said about gender. Remember, this is in 1995. If you consider all the problems that we are now having around the word gender, and she says, the word gender, intended by feminists to refer to the social basis of sex ascription, and thus to reveal sexual politics, has been neutralized by academics so that it now simply refers to biological differences between the sexes. Gender has become an apolitical term, a word that makes it possible to not have to specifically designate woman. Gender makes patriarchy, the historical and political context of power, disappear. So we had 26 years ago, she was making very, very clear why to women like me and her, feminists like ourselves, radical feminists, gender was an unacceptable term because it was a euphemism. We said it was a euphemism. She explains here how clearly it is a euphemism. But what's amazing now is the women entering this debate at this stage to think 26 years ago, we were trying to say that. This was when women's studies became gender studies, became unacceptable to talk about sex, about women, and so on. It was a long time ago.
Did you find that frustrating, looking back at it and thinking? I was just thinking about the same thing. Someone mentioned consent in the chat, and I thought the same. You know, with the Me Too movement and people trying to say, well, what is the difference between, you know, sexual assault and a bad sexual experience? And it's like, these are discussions that have been going on for 30 years. You don't have to reinvent the wheel. Women actually did talk and write about this extensively before. You know, it's not the first generation to discover this as a problem. So is it frustrating looking back, or
it is? It's been disappeared.
Yeah,
all of that work has been disappeared. However, I am excited that feminism is coming back. I mean, the mere fact that we are here and we are having these discussions. It's terrible to reinvent the wheel, but at least there's a wheel to reinvent. And here we are doing it. Here we are doing it. Yes, so another thing that I found really useful about the book, and you've mentioned it already, is the fact that it talks about using human rights mechanisms, because it talks about how to create change around prostitution. And so her work in Prostitution of Sexuality is very action focused. She has, of course, from the 1970s onwards, been working to end female sexual slavery. That's what she has dedicated herself to. And in this book, she explains that she moved to work on prostitution as an international issue of women's human rights through the UN, which was a bold move, because, you know, the 1993 Declaration on Violence Against Women would not only talked about forced prostitution as violence against women. It would not see prostitution as a problem in its own right. But Kathy Barry was determined that prostitution should be seen as a problem in its own right. And so she created the Convention Against Sexual Exploitation. And I'll just share my screen with that as well. This was 1991. The Coalition Against Trafficking in Women had become, under her guidance associated with ECOSOC at the United Nations, and through ECOSOC and the Coalition Against Trafficking in Women, there were meetings to create this Convention Against Sexual Exploitation, by which she wanted to get not just prostitution, but other forms of what she called sexual exploitation into a convention so they could be taken seriously at the UN. Now, I was not totally happy about this at the time. When I first started teaching sexual politics, I did try to talk about the Convention Against Sexual Exploitation, but I'm not completely happy with the definition or the usability of this. So if I'll just go through it with you and see what you think. The definition of sexual exploitation was a practice by which a person or persons achieve sexual gratification or financial gain or advancement through the abuse of a person's sexuality by abrogating that person's human right to dignity, equality, autonomy, and physical and mental well-being. Sounds great. I'm happy with it so far. I think that, there's good, strong human rights terms in there, dignity, equality, et cetera, et cetera. So that sounds okay. But when we get to the definition of what are the forms of sexual exploitation, I think it becomes slightly tricky. She says, sexual exploitation takes the form of, but is not limited to, the denial of life through female infanticide and the murder of women by reason of their gender, including wife and widow murder. I've also already lost it slightly. Female infanticide, I've slightly lost what this sexual exploitation is about. Then she talks about subjection to cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment through the following: battering, not quite sure. Pornography, yes, clearly. Prostitution, yes. Genital mutilation, possibly, and the case can be made. Female seclusion, maybe. Dowry and bride price, forced sterilization, forced childbearing, sexual harassment, rape, incest, sexual abuse, and trafficking. Then she goes on to subjection to sexual abuse and torture, overt or covert, including sadistic mutilating practices, temporary marriage or marriage of convenience. She was mentioning that back in 95, which most people are still not understanding is a form of prostitution, and usually of young girls. And sex predetermination. I'm not sure. How does sex predetermination get into sexual exploitation? So I always found this slightly difficult to use, and of course, though it was created at the right meetings, and there was a lot of enthusiasm to get this before the United Nations so that it could get accepted as a convention. That didn't happen because there were many against what she was trying to do. But I'm also not sure if she had got it through, how exactly we would have used it, because sexual exploitation seems to me not the best way of describing these things. Somebody's saying, are all those quotes from the Prostitution of Sexuality? Yes, the Convention on Sexual Exploitation is at the end of the book. She explains it and what she means by it and so on, and it is there at the end of the book. So you can find it there. It's also collected in other collections as well. Also, of course, I found, and you've already talked about this, the stuff on the industrialization of prostitution, really, really important, because nobody was talking about that. Nobody was giving the economics. And I do try to do that, of course, in The Industry of Vagina. And when she's talking about the industrialization of sex, she says, since 1970, the most dramatic changes in prostitution have been its industrialization, normalization, and widespread global diffusion. Its related industries, sex clubs, massage parlors, brothels, and of course I talk about how, making the costumes for strippers, the whiskey that's sold in the clubs. There's a huge amount of economic investment in the sex industry generally.
Can I just add to that? Because I was just going to say, structurally, I think she says some interesting things about that too. And I picked up on it again. I wrote something recently for Labour and Industry, which is an industrial relations journal, about, all right, what if we take the idea of sex workers' work seriously? It would actually meet all of the International Labour Organization's criteria for what they call unacceptable work, which means it should be abolished. And I think it's interesting. One of the things that came up in doing that work was the way in which there isn't a lot of recognition anymore of the way prostitution forms like a de facto social safety net economically. Obviously, it's incredibly harmful, but the way that means the state doesn't actually have to intervene as a welfare state for women in the same way that it does for men. And I think she actually picks up on that in a couple of instances, but particularly in that transition you're talking about from non-industrial to industrial and post-industrial societies, and the way that it leaves this class of women behind, essentially. And she talks about the manipulation of developing economies by more wealthy Western nations, what we'd now say probably the global North. And she has another kind of great line, I think, summarizing that. And when she's talking about, all right, prior to industrialization, women are exploited within the family, but also expect some sort of economic stability from the family. But then through industrialization, prostitution is the only economic possibility for some women in poverty. And then she kind of, really slams it home at the end, where she says prostitution is a dumping ground for women between the patriarchal family structure and the industrializing labor force. And I think that just gets so lost in a lot of analyses that we see now. That's, again, that high structural level analysis of what happens to this group of women.
That's right. And prostitution, since, as I'm sure she would say and others do, is a form of primitive slavery. So there's no other forms of primitive slavery of exactly that kind which have come through and being seen as perfectly ordinary work now and industrialized and accepted economically. But this is just the crudest kind of primitive slavery. Time is moving on, so I think I will go forward and say, what would you, Meagan, expect a book on prostitution to cover now?
Definitely the Nordic model. That's probably one of the most glaring omissions from this. Not because it, obviously Barry was not ignoring it, but because it hadn't been established in the way that we understand it now. And she does have a whole section going through legislative approaches and talking about her own move from thinking that total decriminalisation was the way forward, rather than thinking about that, we need to be challenging men's abuse and men's behavior. And that obviously she doesn't talk about the Nordic model, but I think that, if you were to write it again now, that would have to be a huge part of the book. And that would probably maybe be our more hopeful way forward, rather than, as I say, I think there's a lot of cynicism now around that, the high level human rights approaches, although she does caution about falling back on these legalistic approaches. And I think she has a quote something along the lines of, patriarchy will never make itself illegal. So I suppose it is a good reminder for us that those approaches can be important, but they're not going to be the be all and end all. It's still, wholesale structural cultural change is going to be necessary to really, give us any sense of liberation. So that's obviously something that would really need to be in there. I think I was wondering when I was looking back, and I know I sent this to you in an email, Sheila as well, was, what do we conceive ourselves as being in now? If she's talking about the prostitution of sexuality in 95 and we've got 25 years on that, what do we understand that to look like now? When I'm thinking about the things like, there's been certainly studies in Australia that show not just near universal pornography use among young men, but habitual universal use. So either daily or weekly at rates of about 85%. That is a significant generational change. And I can't think of something that embodies the prostitution of sexuality more than that. Yeah. But also, I was just thinking of some people here with us today have probably seen, I know Caroline Norma wrote something that appeared on the women question, I should say, talking about kind of the brothel model of dating apps and the kind of the way in which the sex industry.
That's really interesting.
And I was wondering if is that kind of what we're moving towards? Because, she almost argues maybe this is a step towards the revolution. Like, it's so much worse and it's so embedded and endemic now that you are seeing this almost collapsing of the sex industry into normal heterosexuality. Maybe that will be the turning point for women to realise there's not much in this.
Certainly into normal prostitution, because men don't have to go to prostitutes now. They can actually use dating apps, which is an easier way to get sex with, which is freer and no strings attached. But the incredible danger of it, I cannot imagine. We know how dangerous it is for women in prostitution who are alone and they have to fight off men who are potentially violent. And there are women all going on dating apps and then getting strangled to death. I mean, that is the situation that we are in. So yes, things are collapsing on themselves. I agree with you.
And kind of going back the other way too, that I know Project Respect in Melbourne, who, I know you'd be familiar with their work, Sheila, but they were, I remember they were talking about even a few years ago now that women in prostitution seeking support from them were saying that they felt pressure had been forced downwards on prices because of dating apps.
Yes,
and so you're seeing, so it's starting to feed back in the other direction again.
There's something to be, yes, okay, Meagan, next book, please. We need to put all of this together. No, I'm serious. We need to put all of this together.
I know you are. That's the horrifying thing.
There is new stuff. It needs to be put together, and it's very important.
But it does. I think the business model's changing on this. We don't have it anywhere near enough on that. I'll give a big shout out to Laura McVeigh. I don't know if she's going to maybe watch the recording of this, but she's one of my PhD students that's about to finish, and she's doing some phenomenal work on understanding how platforms recruit women to produce their own prostitution through pornography in things, like Pornhub, and just the lack of detail that we actually have to analyse as feminists. That's something we really need to be doing, and that's important work.
Yes. Absolutely. Now, we haven't got much time, but I wonder if you might talk about what's happening in Victoria now, because I know that there is something important happening in terms of prostitution legislation.
I will try and keep it brief, but thank you for mentioning that, because I think it's perhaps another example of how far you can go down the prostitution of sexuality in terms of normalisation. And that's, as anyone who's familiar with your work would know, there's been legalised brothel prostitution in Victoria for a very long time, one of the oldest legalised systems of brothel prostitution in the world. And we have moved now, essentially it's not entirely done yet, but is very likely to be completed shortly, to full decriminalisation. And that is in large part, it sounds horrifying to anyone I talk to outside of Victoria even, but certainly Australia, that we ended up with a lobby group from the sex industry forming a political party. So it was the Eros Foundation, which was sex industry business owners formed and were quite open in forming a political party called the Sex Party. The former CEO of the Eros Foundation became the head of the Sex Party. It was actually called the Sex Party. She became a member of Parliament. They rebranded eventually to be seen as more centrist and called themselves the Reason Party. She was re-elected. And then the Labor Party, I'm very sorry to say, in my home state, then gave her the chair role to form an inquiry. I'm doing a lot of air quotes today, but I think they're justified, into what kind of legislative approach there should be in Victoria to deal with prostitution. And she had very publicly for about 20 years been lobbying for total decriminalisation. Unsurprisingly, she found that should be the right option. And it was kind of just this incredible instance of corruption, but hiding itself as normalized political practice because the sex industry had so embedded itself into the normal political process with very little kind of even comment from political elites or commentators that this might be a conflict of interest, or that there might be some issues here in terms of representing, industry and big business rather than workers' rights. Even on that level, nothing. So yeah, she chaired that, and the report that is due out about it has never been released, and apparently it's too sensitive to be released. And I think that's the double bind that you get in systems like this, where you have it's a job like any other. This is completely normal, but then you say, okay, can we see the evidence for it? And suddenly it becomes too secret and too harmful and too much of a problem. So it's really this extraordinary case study in what happens if the sex industry takes hold at the level that it has done in Victoria. And I know some of the Catwa Australia women have been talking with Catwa International, and we're actually going to host a seminar talking about what's going on in Victoria. But I think the link ultimately is that really the concepts and the detail that Barry provides in this book allow you to understand what has happened in instances like this, and the way that I think what's gone on in Victoria will be weaponized and used against women elsewhere.
Yes. And it is grim. And what I noticed, and I'm aware of now that I'm no longer in Melbourne and in Victoria, is how very isolated Australia is, and states in Australia, from what's going on in the world, because that's happening on transgenderism as well. All the worst legislation is getting passed in Victoria, as if they've not noticed that there's a world in which things are changing. And exactly
Keating always said it was the arse end of the earth, and that's probably still true.
It's exactly the same on prostitution, but it's very hard to understand why, especially now with Zoom and the internet, Victoria is not in contact with the world. It's a kind of extraordinary situation.
Well, you hear about British exceptionalism all the time. We have our own version of that here, certainly.
Yes.
And hegemonic Australian masculinity is one of the nastiest forms going around. I think there's a lot to be said on that too, but we can leave that for another day. We can leave that for another day. Now, have you noticed any questions that need to be answered as we're going through? I did see there was one in the Q&A. Oh, this is I would be interested to know this answer from you. Anyway, Sheila, I think you're talking about the proposed draft on sexual exploitation, and the question is, if sexual exploitation isn't the best words to describe the problem, what is it? So I guess what would maybe you have done in place of some of the issues that you had with the draft convention there? I don't know. Obviously, my new book is Penile Imperialism, but I don't think we can probably have a convention against penile imperialism. A UN convention against penile imperialism might be a stretch. That would be lovely. Yes, the United Nations Convention against penile imperialism. That covers everything. It covers pretty much everything. And then they'd really have to think, what could sex be? What could men do with women that wasn't actually covered by that umbrella term? And there may not be a great deal left, it's fair to say, of what is recognized as sex right now on this planet. Anyway, somebody's just saying, what is Meagan's book? Do you want to just say something about your book on porn and sexology before we finish? Yes, I should. I'll find a link for you, but to put in the chat. But yes, it was out of my PhD thesis, and was called Selling Sex Short, the Pornographic and Sexological Construction of Women's Sexuality, which I'm always told was too long a title. But you can still read the introduction on my academia site that I linked to before. So that gives you a good overview of what it's about. But yeah, it was kind of, I suppose, if you imagine a whole book, but of those Kathleen Barry quotes expanded out to 80,000 words, kind of showing the way in which the pornography industry was becoming legitimized through sexology, but also the way that sexology was popularizing itself by using pornography. It was that same kind of, I suppose, feedback loop like we've been talking about with prostitution and heterosexuality, and the way that they were really creating an even more harmful version of heterosexuality and marketing it to women, not just as, I suppose, fun or something extra, but their fundamental duty, our fundamental duty to kind of undertake. And it's still horrifying to me when you see there was, oh God, I can't think of the name, Gwyneth Paltrow. They're doing some horrible now online thing, continuing her ghastly set of things women should do And there was one about sex therapy and sex therapists using what they call sex surrogates. Again, I know you're familiar with all this, Sheila, but it's essentially, sexologically approved prostitution.
Yep.
And the fact that you would think that this is, these are medical professionals with significant authority. And I think that's one of the things that was so upsetting, was reading the stories of women who'd gone to therapists for help and basically been told to model their sexuality on prostitution. And you think these are people who think there's nothing wrong with someone existing purely to sexually service another person. And, that's very much, again, at the heart of Barry's book, that is dehumanizing, and it is actually a violation of human rights.
Wonderful. That stuff in your book is absolutely gripping, and nobody else is doing it, and nobody else has written about it. It's as wonderful now as the day you wrote it.
Which was a long time ago now. I know that, that's 10 years.
Now.
10 years,
That's
Sheila.
right. That's right. Okay, I think we've probably come to the end of this now. So thanks very much, Meagan. It was absolutely wonderful to talk with you.
Thank you so much for the invitation, and for all the comments in the chat as well, and all the wonderful people who've been posting links, because I haven't been able to get to them. You're legends. Thanks so much.
Yes, thanks very much indeed. Bye for now.
Take care.